counterterrorism and terrorist group leadership. And then also the notion of creating partnerships, local partnerships, who could do the fighting. We could help them to do the fighting themselves. Looking back, Obama administration, 5.5 years, how effective has that been? And what does the landscape look like, you know, here 5.5 years into the administration with respect to, we're going to talk about ISIS, but at least with respect to Al-Qaeda, which we're one day off of the 9/11 anniversary, so it's still, Al-Qaeda is still a big issue.
So I think that the view of everyone who has served in government in the last decade plus is that the drone program, for all of its maybe unpopularity in some sectors of the public, is enormously effective, very precise, invaluable in terms of removing the leadership of Al-Qaeda. It is I think, you know, one of the debates has been, doesn't it engender a great deal of blowback? That is to say, resentment of the United States, helping out, you know, build sympathy for our enemies and the like. I think that is to some extent overstated, although not entirely. There are countries out there that find it in their interest to build up the notion that this is an indiscriminate weapon and profoundly unpopular and a breach of their sovereignty. I hope more people can see through those kinds of claims than perhaps has been the case in the past. At the same time, I think the president's right that you know, the drone is a very effective tool, but it needs to be used sparingly, strategically, carefully, and you know, I would say that in government, people think very hard about the consequences of every single strike. As for the capacity building agenda, the partnership agenda, it's a work in progress. I think a lot of positive work has been done to date. I say that despite having read the newspaper this morning, and there's a lot of turmoil in Sana'a, which is probably ground zero for this kind of work, and where I think we've actually made great strides. I think the president is right that the future of foreign counterterrorism will be focused to a great extent on building these capacities and helping countries deal with the threats that are in their neighborhoods. And we do want stronger states that can deal with these threats. This has to be a global effort, and we are working that. I have to say that it is really a problem, though, because the U.S. system of government is not well adapted to that kind of long-term strategy. And annual appropriations, gridlock in Congress, things like that, it makes it tough to be the kind of superpower that we need to be, that will engage for long periods of time with countries that have sometimes fluky leadership, all kinds of strange developments that happen. A year may go by without a serious terrorism problem, and yet we need to be engaged for a long period of time. We don't, it's often been said that America doesn't have an imperial vocation, and I think that's right, but at the same time, we do have global responsibilities, and building those relationships and working with those partners really takes time and perseverance.
Dan, can I just add?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask you your assessment on those points.
Look, the drone program, so first I would say to you, it is a critical tool in an overall comprehensive strategy. It's not the only tool, but it's an important tool. Why? Because it is very precise and very important in terms of taking out the leadership of an organization. That's more important than just the leaders themselves, right? Because it disrupts and perturbates an entire network and throws the organization into disarray. For the longest time, the shortest lifespan was the number 3 of Al-Qaeda. Why? That was the job you didn't want. That was the external operations planner, and that was the guy, when you took him out, you really did effectively disrupt external plots, and external to them is internal to us. So incredibly important. I must say I was a little taken aback by the comment that President Obama views the drones to be used sparingly and strategically, I think were the words that you used. President Obama increased the use of drones over the Bush administration. They have been more prolifically used. It's documented by outside groups. than they were used in the Bush administration. They're to be commended for that because I think they used it very well. But it is a weapon over time that must be far more integrated into a comprehensive overall strategy, but one that we will continue to need to use for some time.
Thank you. The question I was going to ask was, you've spent a lot of time in the White House focusing on Al-Qaeda. Sometimes people, just when discussing it, they say, well, we've really damaged the organization that hurt us on 9/11, but in many ways it's metastasized, it's spread. There are many smaller groups, we can call them affiliates, associated groups in North Africa, other places that have gained footholds there and affected life for the civilian population. So looking at where Al-Qaeda stands now, how do you see it, and how do you see how the Obama administration strategy has dealt with it?
No question that we have that over the course, frankly, of 2 administrations, you've seriously hurt Al-Qaeda's leadership. It is to be commended, obviously, the Abbottabad raid, bringing bin Laden to justice, all of that degrades the organization's capabilities. And it's funny, when you see Zawahiri last week issue a video statement like a petulant child who's not being paid sufficient attention to, you got to say to yourself, we've done a pretty good job as a country of degrading the relevance and the capability of Al-Qaeda. That's Al-Qaeda core, right? That's the leadership, the old, let's call it the old Al-Qaeda. That's the good news. The bad news is the metastasized threat, that the affiliates who are like-minded, it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, it's the Islamic State, there are elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, all of these terrorist groups that are out there remain. And so, and Dan, Ambassador Benjamin, was alluding to this when he talked about, there's 2 Dans, it's going to be too confusing.
I'm David, it's okay, it's all right.
So, but there is a real crying need. Two administrations, neither of whom have effectively dealt with countering the ideology. Dan said it, I'll say it. We need a comprehensive national approach to dealing with taking on the terrorist narrative. Look, these are really bad people beyond the blowing things up. Lousy human rights record, deny polio vaccines and health care to their own populations, kill more Muslims than they kill Westerners. I mean, crucifixions, beheadings, deny women education. I mean, there's a whole narrative to talk about how bad these people are to their own populations, and we've just not done a very good job. I told the story today to some students. In the immediate aftermath of James Foley's beheading, those of us in the media actually watched the whole video. Count yourself lucky not to have had to do that. I tweeted when I was going on CNN an hour before, and my Twitter account was deluged with pictures of the actual beheaded body of James Foley. Now, why is that? Why do I tell the story? Why is it important? It's important because either ISIS or its sympathizers had the tactical capability to respond. They planned it in advance. That image did not appear on mainstream media in the United States, so they had access to the image, and they were able to disseminate it real time to journalists and people that would be on television. We should envy that capability because we don't have a tactical capability to be able to deploy like that in the media. We need it, and we need to counter the narrative, and we need to commit to building it across multiple administrations, which I think it's going to take.
Thank you. So I want to turn to Libya for a moment before we go to Iraq, because I think a lot of the experience in Libya has informed our policy and maybe has lessons for what we may be embarking on in Syria. Dan, you were in office then. We entered this ostensibly on humanitarian grounds, similar to how President Obama re-entered this conflict with ISIS for the first instance with the Yazidis on the mountain. Then we participated in the effort to remove Gaddafi from power. There was initial euphoria about the removal of a brutal dictator, but then we've really seen a struggle in terms of forming any sort of stable government, deep-seated tribal conflicts, the rise of heavily armed militias. We've seen advances by Al-Qaeda related groups, and then of course we're also 2 years off of the tragic attack on our consulate in Benghazi and the murder of 4 another good public servants. So what does the experience in Libya tell us about how we should and how we should not fight terrorism?
Well, let me put a slightly different twist on the question, if I may. There is a tendency to perhaps think of our experience of terrorism as being a single arc that, you know, goes from wherever you want, you know, the East Africa embassy bombings to today. And I think the story is a little more complicated, and Libya is a perfect place to jump in and talk about it. So we've had a very successful campaign, I think, against core Al-Qaeda, and we've been doing well against a number of the affiliates or franchises. But what happened in 2011 and after was the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring is something that I think elicited enormously positive feelings from most of us because we saw one frozen autocracy after another suddenly upended by its own people. There was clearly a desire for democracy, for representative institutions, and we saw change that certainly most people who've been working on these issues and been involved with these countries had never anticipated. And it was a surprise at least as great as the collapse of the Soviet Union. But what also happened was that all of the instruments, all of the agents of public order in those countries also collapsed, along with the dictatorships. And they are not institutions any of us should be really nostalgic for, because they were the repressive secret police of the interior ministries. But once they were gone, we were in an entirely new world, and it's a world that in the bureaucracy has come to be known as the new normal. That is to say, a whole host of countries where you cannot count on the governments to provide security. And this, so what became leavened with our hope for the future, and I think that hope still exists, if it's somewhat tempered by hard experience, what became clear is that we had an enormous amount of turmoil on our hands, and into those vacuums, into those countries where there wasn't sufficient security, you know, those who were boldest and often most brutal thrust themselves. And so in Libya, a particularly bad case, because Gaddafi had systematically destroyed the institutions in the country over many, many years, jihadists came to the fore pretty quickly. Similarly, in Syria, the uprising against Assad became a real opportunity for jihadists to come into action, to expand their area of operation, and really to capitalize on a widespread Sunni desire to get, in this case, payback for the fact that Iraq had left the Sunni column in 2003 when US forces toppled Saddam. So this is an endemic situation across all those countries that have been experiencing you know, Arab Spring uprisings, and it has changed the nature of the counterterrorism challenge dramatically. And it is really a tough question to answer for that reason. On the one hand, we need to deal with these threats, and we really need the neighborhood to deal with these threats, the various countries where this is happening, and their neighboring countries, as long as they still have stability. But you know, we're facing a level of disarray that has just simply never been seen before.
Fran, what are our lessons? What does Libya tell us about the region and our challenges at the moment?
Look, I actually think, I take some issue with the description, because I think actually in Libya, there were lessons to have been learned from Iraq, right? There's a legion of criticisms of the prior administration, but among them was our failure to plan for what we call phase 4 operations, that is post-conflict reconstitution of a government, support for democratic institution building. And I think that's fair. I think it's fair that we should have and could have done more there. I view Libya as a repetition of the Iraq mistake. I mean, I had been in Libya not 10 days before the attack on the consulate in Benghazi. It was perfectly clear that we felt very good about, and rightly so, for having built a successful international coalition that toppled Gaddafi. But the US government, the coalition, moved on to kind of the next problem and didn't stay behind with a plan, a real resourced plan for how to assist the Libyans in reconstituting a democratic government. And so in some ways, while it is true to say you've got neighbors and allies and there's more that could and should have been done by then, we bear the burden of responsibility for what we find ourselves in Libya, which is an increasingly looks like a failed state.
Are you suggesting we should have done an Iraq-style occupation, large-scale nation building?
Nope.
Well, what is the Phase 4 operation then that we should have done?
So look, I started by saying I give credit for the building of the international coalition and the execution of the operation that topples Gaddafi. But that needed to continue. So the same international coalition, coordinated by the United States, needed to have in place a plan for success, right? They enjoyed success in the military phase. They needed to plan for a more protracted Phase 4, where they supported the building of institutions and the establishment of a democratic government there.
Okay, I think that sets us up well for Iraq. Let me start with you, Dan. The administration critics say that after the surge in the Sunni awakening in 2007, 2008, we had essentially, maybe another year or so later, we had strategically defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. But yet, out of the dust heap of AQI, we're seeing now a bigger, more powerful organization, ISIS. And the critics say this happened, and I'm channeling my inner Peter Fever here, that this happened in many ways because the administration took its eyes off of Iraq. It was too eager to leave. It wanted very much to leave. It allowed the sectarian Maliki to go off on his own devices. The Iraqi army was not ready to stand on its own, and that is the genesis of the problem that we're facing today. What do you say to that narrative?
Well, I'll have to channel someone too, but I'm not quite sure who it'll be yet. So first of all, I would say that the notion that the surge and the Sunni awakening had actually achieved any durable results is itself untrue, and that what the surge had really done was deal with symptoms of an underlying disease, but not the disease itself. And that disease resurfaced under Maliki, and that is the fundamental sectarian conflict there. And I would add it's a sectarian conflict fed by outsiders as well, and that it is one that was an expression of really almost 4 decades of antipathy between Saudi Arabia and other Sunnis and Iran on the other side. And there was a tug of war going on there. And that, in fact, absent, just an extraordinary figure who could create a truly inclusive government, this was, a problem that was in the future of Iraq. And I think many proponents, former proponents of the surge, I think have come to see that as well. And I think it's interesting that General Petraeus has also said, we should not become Iran's or the Shia's air force in Iraq. So, my own view is that in 2003, we lifted the lid off a set of problems that we, I think, had we thought about, would never want to confront. So this creates, an enormous set of challenges for us now. I think it's, it's in our greatest interest to have a unitary state. I have my questions as to whether or not that is possible, but it's going to be a long, hard slog, and it's by no means certain that success is even possible, given the antipathy that has grown between Sunni and Shia. So I got half of the answer, but there was more to your question, I think.
Well, my question was, could more have been done?
Oh,
More
so-
care and
right.
feeding, essentially, in the
Yeah, so,
period, rather than a fairly...
My feeling is, no, it was the longest war, second longest war in US history. We were on the ground for a long time. We couldn't get the status of forces agreement that has been absolutely standard in every long-term deployment by the United States. And the fact is, the administration, whatever some of its critics may say, knocked itself out to try to get that agreement. Colin Kahl, who was like the DASD, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, who was responsible for Iraq, has written at length about this. They tried, and the Iraqis said no. The Iraqis said they weren't going to put it through their parliament because it would be defeated. And under those circumstances in the past, the U.S. has not left a significant number of troops on the ground. And the other thing that I think that is really important to note here, and is that, you know, if there was something else that was to be done, it would not have been in Iraq, it would have been in Syria, because it was ultimately the Syrian civil war that really gave ISIS a chance to come back in a way that became so incredibly dangerous to the entire region. I think that the Iraqis would have had their hands full with an Al-Qaeda challenge beyond the sectarian challenge that they had even in Baghdad. But Syria has made that well nigh impossible.
Fran, do you think a greater engagement, troops lasting an extra 3, 5, how many more years in Iraq would have had a consequence on where we are now with ISIS?
The short answer to that is not without a credible representative government in Iraq would any amount of forces make a difference. So let me start where we agree, and we agree on the idea you do not leave United States military anywhere without a status of forces agreement. So start with that. I think we may have something of a different view about was the effort to get that status of forces agreement addressed early enough, at a senior enough level, with enough of an effort. So let's put that aside, because we probably have a difference of opinion there, but it's probably not important. On the surge and the impact of the surge, look, the sectarian violence inside Iraq prior to the surge was off the charts high. I mean, I was there in November of 2003, I guess. It was a very dangerous place, and when I had been there, it was on the rise. So the surge interrupted that. It killed Zarqawi, we targeted the network. We were incredibly successful against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were in disarray. What did that do? That set the conditions for a credible, representative Iraqi government to build a political apparatus, which they failed to do. They failed to take advantage of the space that had been built for them, and that's what really, you know, so when Maliki then doesn't share power with the Sunnis feel aggrieved. That's what creates the conditions for the resurgence, the reestablishment of the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq to turn into ISIS and to launch themselves into the Syrian civil war so that they have battle-hardened experience.
Okay, so here we are. The president is speaking in a number of hours. We have the reality of this organization, ISIS. It has an irregular army. It has captured a significant amount of territory on both sides of the border. It has certainly terrorized its civilian populations, and we know, of course, about what's happened to the 2 American journalists. So I'd like to ask both of you, what do you think the president should say tonight to both explain to the American people the nature of this threat and then what the United States ought to do about it? Fran, I'll let you go first this time.
Okay, so look, I do think the president is rightly focused on, and the administration is rightly focused on building an international coalition. I do think it has to be a strategy. Look, I think this is a much bigger problem addressing it now than if we addressed it had begun to address it a year ago in Syria, as he had suggested he was going to do. I think he's got to not talk about what he's not going to do, right? The notion of taking things off the table like ground forces, You don't, presidents aren't supposed to be talking about what they're not going to do. They're supposed to be talking about what they are going to do, and then they've got to do it. I think there's a credibility problem. So whatever he says, he really actually needs to do it. I do think that it has to be in all instruments of national power: military, diplomatic, economic, so you use your financial tools. It's all of it, and you've got to bring it all to bear. This is not going to be a simple one vector approach to the problem. I don't think, the administration came out yesterday, you all would have seen, and said that part of the president's strategy and discussion tonight will be that this is likely to go 3 years. That is a year beyond the end of his second term. I think that will be a tragic mistake for a whole host of reasons. It's very difficult to convince your international partners to join a coalition that you're suggesting is going to have to remain in place after you're out of office. Let's start there. Second, you build up your enemy. What a propaganda win that the President of the United States is going to may stand up and acknowledge that he can't deal with this threat in the time that he has in office. That may turn out to be true, but by the way, the President doesn't know that tonight. I don't know that. You don't know that. And for God's sake, I don't want the enemy, if he thinks that, to know that yet. It really is important that this strategy address both sides of the border. To the extent that you are using your capability in Iraq and not in Syria, you create a safe haven. The bad guys are not that stupid. They'll understand all they have to do is go to the Syrian side of the border and wait out your military campaign. So you must address it on both sides of the border. You must have some capability to provide assistance, training, and support to both the Iraqi army and the Free Syrian Army. What does that mean? Well, if you're asking Fran Townsend, I'd say that means several thousand special operators and military forces and intelligence officials to provide both tactical targeting and the ability to advise military units on the execution against those targets. By the way, we've seen this to be successful. With that kind of assistance, we helped the Iraqis, the Peshmerga, retake the Mosul Dam. And so this is something we know how to do, and we've been successful, including inside Iraq.
So just to be clear, you're saying 1,000 U.S. troops inside, is it Syria, to train the Free Syrian Army?
The number's too small that you use. I think to be effective, you need several thousand. It may be 10. Max Boot has written about 10 to 15,000. I think you need a substantial presence. I don't think that it should be American military forces by themselves. I think that's what a coalition's about. Our Arab allies in the region are directly threatened by this. They're closer to the problem. They're going to have literally skin in this game, and they're going to have forces that are willing to engage in this fight. But I do think it requires force on both sides of the border, Syria and Iraq.
Okay, so that's boots on the ground. It's not boots that are shooting and fighting the enemy, but it's still boots on the ground strategy. Dan, what should the President say tonight about the nature of the threat and what we ought to do about it?
Well, the first thing is I want to disagree a bit with Fran on the issue of taking troops on the ground off the table and talking about the time frame. The President is not only talking to our enemies, he's also talking to the American people. The American people are tired of our military being deployed in the Middle East for such a long time. We've borne an enormous burden in this war. We lost several thousand people more than we lost on 9/11. When all the health care costs are paid, this war will have, along with Afghanistan, have left us with a $5 trillion bill. I think people have a right to know what it is we're getting into. I would also say that it doesn't pass the straight face test to say that we will restore a place as screwed up as Iraq is now in a short period of time, and I give the President points for credibility. I think that it's, first of all, I'm not entirely sure what all instruments of national power are, so let's talk about that a little later. If it means that we're going to start filling up Guantanamo, if it means that we're going to return to enhanced interrogation, I think I would have some real concerns about that. But I would say that Fran and I are in agreement that there has to be a strong coalition. I personally think that the U.S. can have forces on the ground in Iraq for a train and assist mission, but we should not be in a combat mission. It is time for the region to take care of this problem. It is not time for the United States to go back into Iraq for another unlimited deployment. And I think that, from what I'm told, the consultations on the consultations on the coalition are going quite well, that everyone in the region recognizes what the threat is. There are a lot of capabilities there. And we're actually seeing other countries in the region, the UAE and Egypt, for example, show tremendous concern about the rise of dangerous jihadis far outside their borders. So I think that there will be good news on the coalition side, and I think that that can be driven in the right direction. I think the U.S. Can use the careful application of air power to assist this coalition. I think it also should arm and supply intelligence to help those on the ground in a very constructive sort of way. We've done this as well in a number of countries, and I think it can be effective. What I hope the president will also do is push back a bit against some of the hysteria that has accompanied the discussion of ISIS, because first of all, this is a group that is somewhat contained in its region right now. It can't overrun the Kurds. It can't overrun the Shia militias and take over Baghdad or southeastern Iraq. And its neighbors in Saudi Arabia and Jordan have quite sufficient military, and Turkey, I should say, have sufficient military capabilities to constrain it. The other thing I think he should say is that, quite frankly, the discussion's overheated. He may not want to contradict his Secretary of Defense, but all the intelligence reports on ISIS so far do not suggest that this is an imminent threat against the United States at home.
Fran, ISIS, is it a group that is mostly inward-looking and wants to capture territory and establish a so-called government under a very draconian, distorted interpretation of Sharia law? Is it mostly about the intentions about that, or do you think it's part of its DNA to try to attack America or attack American interests? What should we be thinking about in terms of the threat of ISIS?
So the last time I heard the description of they're not an immediate threat was Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They're a regional group with regional aspirations, and they brought you the underwear bomber with no indications and warning. So welcome to this world of counterterrorism. We are sitting here tonight, and you are not likely to get another warning when these guys are going to turn and decide to use what their capability is against us here at home. It's the nature of the threat, right? It's not hype, it's just what it is. By the way, ISIS as a group has stated their intention to attack the American homeland. They've got, you've heard the numbers, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 Americans who are fighting, some of whom, the good news is, some of them will be killed on the battlefield, some we know already have. Some will seek to return home. 700 French, 500 British. These are all estimates. They're on the conservative side. There are likely more, and those are people who, by the way, if they survive and they won't go back to their home countries, they may not plot a homeland attack. They could, because of course they don't need a visa to get in here. They just have to buy a plane ticket. But they may seek to attack our interests and the interests of the West in their home countries. You can't pretend this one away. You're going to have to deal with it. But we have the capability to deal with it. These guys are difficult to track because they often travel on false documents. But this has been the subject of incredible amounts of information and intelligence sharing among our intelligence allies around the world, including in Europe, including throughout the Arab world. And so I'm confident we can deal with it, but we can't pretend that they are not, that the foreign fighter threat and the ISIS threat is not a threat here at home.
You want to rejoin her on that?
Just 2 points. So Fran and I agree that you can't talk the threat away. The two key elements, a safe haven and lots of foreign fighters, ought to give everyone pause and, in fact, real concern. But having said that, let's also remember that whether it was Afghanistan, Iraq in '03, lots of foreign fighters. Admittedly, a lot more have gone to Syria. but they did not cause a problem. The last time we had a serious problem with foreign fighters was after the jihad against the Soviet Union, when it was a real problem for a lot of Arab countries, not really very much for the West. So we need to be cautious. We need to take on ISIS. I'm not disputing that at all. But I really hope that we don't get our hair on fire. You know, 47%, according to an NBC poll that was released yesterday, 7% of Americans now believe that we are at greater risk than at any time since 9/11. So, you know, in 2002, we had Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, you know, undoubtedly the most capable terrorist planner ever, was still alive and on the loose. Bin Laden was on the loose. Much of the Al-Qaeda leadership was at large. It's hard to believe that anyone could think we're in any kind of peril compared to that. And that tells me a lot about what has been going on in the media and what has been going on, frankly, in Washington.
We can't blame the media for this, frankly. I mean, there's lots of crazy in the media. I'm not here to defend the media. But
So what are
I
you
mean,
doing
people
on CNN there?
But people really are. I mean, you ask yourself, why are 47% feeling less safe? Al-Qaeda never had territory that spanned a sovereign border in Iraq and Syria. Al-Qaeda didn't have hundreds of millions of dollars that they had seized. They didn't have traditional Western military equipment that they seized from Iraqi army depots. I mean, and so if people, and by the way, and videos of Americans being beheaded, that yes, there had been Daniel Pearl and Daniel Berg, they didn't get the Daniel Pearl one did, but the others did not get the sort of notoriety of the James Foley and Stephen Sotloff and the graphicness of these videos. So I will tell you, I understand
But that's
American
what terrorists
concern.
do. They
That's
use
right.
those moments to try to generate fear to influence policy. So have they been successful? Have the video tapings of the beheadings, and is our reaction in some way feeding into their tactics?
I will tell you that having, as I said to you, seen the videos are of a more sophisticated nature than anything we've ever seen from Al-Qaeda. What do I mean? They are very slickly edited. They are very carefully put together. A recent video that ISIS released included their drone footage. Yes, they've gone into the commercial market and bought drones, and they did surveillance of the Iraqi military base before they attacked it, and they show all that in their videos. I mean, this is quite the media production, and they understand the propaganda value of that. And it is true, I think we have to be very careful about how we talk about the threat, to not hype it, not to encourage fear. But I mean, I think we have to talk straight and honest to the American people about the threat and the capability of this organization and the threat they represent to our interests.
Let's talk a bit about this international coalition. We had trainers in Iraq for about 8 years. We were spending billions of dollars training the Iraqi army. Did very poorly when confronted by ISIS. Peshmerga lost battles very quickly. Even Assad's forces are getting beaten pretty badly in some places. Why do we think a lesser commitment of training in terms of numbers of trainers and money is going to be any more successful in confronting ISIS than the Iraqi army, which we spent 8 years trying to build?
So no amount of money and effort and training was going to overcome, shall we say, the defect of the new Iraq's birth, which is the sectarian divide. And as soon as he could, Maliki was hollowing out that military because he was worried about it being a source of opposition. We're talking about countries that haven't gone through the kind of devastating experience and really almost, year zero, if you think back to 1945, kind of experience that Iraq had as its army was dissolved, as its civil service was largely dissolved. So, Iraq is a bad case for talking about the capacity building mission. we've been training and working and wargaming with Jordanians, Turks, and Saudis for decades. And this is, you know, a completely different kind of operation. We will have to do our best to get the Iraqis back in the game. And it has to be everyone's hope, it seems to me, that the new Iraq, the new government under Haider al-Abadi is in fact inclusive and accepts that it faces an existential threat. If they don't accept that, then we're looking at the dissolution of Iraq, because they will not be able to manage this, and we will be pouring money into the sand. But we have to give it, you know, a good try, because a unitary state of Iraq is still our best hope. If that fails, then we're going to be relying on regional partners, on a bilateral relationship with a Kurdistan, a new Kurdish state, and I have a feeling that it will be up to the Iranians to stiffen the Iraqi Shia spines.
Well, that brought me to my next question, then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So ISIS is a big problem for two of our adversaries in this region, the Assad government and Iran. If we destroy ISIS, as some are asking for and some are promising, this will be the third time we've removed a big adversary to Iran from the battlefield, the Taliban, Saddam Hussein, and now ISIS. So how should this strategy be crafted so that we are, so it's not that anything we do to degrade ISIS behooves to the benefit of Iran and the Assad regime?
Yeah, look, I think you've got to, this is why tonight's speech by the president is very important, right? The single most important part to the strategy, I mean, I laid out all the things I think it needs to include. The thing I didn't mention, probably the most important, is you've got, what is your objective? What is it you are seeking to accomplish? And you have to state that clearly for a whole bunch of reasons, but it's especially true if you're going to commit military forces to it. Because your military needs to understand what's the objective, because it also tells them when are they done, right? So I actually think you've got to define this in a way that allows you, the American interest here is a narrow interest. We care about our own security and our own interests. We care about the threat to us. We are there, the reason the international coalition is so important is because we care about regional stability, and we are there to assist our neighbors. We care about that, and we are there to support them. But they've got to put their shoulder down to the grindstone and deal with that. We're going to have to deal with the consequences of trying to achieve those objectives. There may be some benefit to Assad himself. I mean, you've mentioned Iran, but of course, ISIS represents a threat to the Assad regime. We seek to see Assad run from office, and so there may be some temporary reprieve he gets out of that. We're going to have to deal with the consequences of trying to achieve the objectives that are in our near-term and longer-term.
So should we really be talking about containing ISIS and not degrading and ultimately destroying, which is the phrase that's popping up in the newspapers in anticipation of the president's speech?
Well, let me begin just by saying that just because it benefits countries that we don't like much doesn't mean that there isn't an overriding interest in having it happen anyway. And it is in our interest to degrade ISIS. Having said that, I do think it's critically important if and when we start taking an air campaign against ISIS in Syria, that we don't get so far out there in terms of the robustness, aggressiveness of the strikes, that we start losing our Sunni partners in the region, because right now they're on board, they're invested, but they will quickly lose interest if they see that the damage done in Syria to ISIS is so significant that Assad can essentially reclaim his position and will make real strides there. So there's going to be a lot of tiptoeing in this area, and it's not fun, and it's not really militarily satisfying to have limited goals in a situation like this, but it's politically essential.
Are you saying that we need to be engaged militarily in the Syrian civil war against Assad more aggressively?
Well, so I'm agnostic, to not to say skeptical, about where we are now in that tragedy. And I was among those who thought that we should have built up one of the parties early on. But I fear that given the current state of the non-jihadist opposition, that there are not a lot of options there, and that the possibility of really building one up is going to be quite limited. We may need to try anyway, but I'm not holding my breath for enormous success. And so I think that the interim goal in the struggle against ISIS is going to be to smash it in Iraq and hope it withdraws to Syria, where it can be dealt with, in part at least, by the Syrian regime.
Well, I want to invite...
Can I just say before...
Yes, well, let me just invite the audience, and we can answer while they're gathering. But we have microphones on the first floor, on the ground floor. If there are people watching in the overflow that would like to try to come out and ask a question, you're allowed to come on out. So, yes, Fran.
So while you're all gathering, I think any airstrikes, I mean, if in the President's announcement tonight, if we're only committing to using air power in Iraq, and it does not include a comprehensive campaign to degrade and defeat ISIS, it's got to include hitting them also in Syria. Because otherwise you are only putting the real problem off. You're not going to defeat them by allowing them to retreat to a safe haven.
Well, and I agree there should be strikes in Syria, but I think they're going to have to be calibrated. So anyway.
Okay, I think our first questioner, and please, audience, let's ask a question to our guests and try to refrain from making lengthy statements.
I'm Gautam Hathi, I'm a sophomore, and I was wondering, both of you sort of mentioned that the only way that these problems are going to be solved eventually is if the Iraqis and the Syrians and so on and so forth sort of create the conditions for them to be solved. But a lot of the reason why they can't do these is because they're sort of the borders have been drawn, years and years ago in ways that don't make a lot of sense. So I was wondering if you think there's a way forward to solve these problems without a general reordering of the Middle East, and if not, then what do we do? Do we try and keep a lid on it ourselves? Do we let it burn out? What do we do?
So, I mean, I would say to you, something Dan said is very important. There is, both in the Syrian civil war and in the threat from ISIS, there is this proxy war going on, this sort of regional struggle between the Shia, represented by Iran, and the Sunni, represented by Saudi and other Sunni powers. We are not going to resolve that. There is, and taking that on, I think, would be a horrific tragedy. We're not credible there, and we can't solve that. What you've got to ask yourself is, what are our interests, and where can we influence the outcome of it, and where can we sort of encourage others to participate? That's why in this case, because there's this bigger proxy war going on, it's incredibly important to bring your allies to the table and make sure that what you're trying to do is kind of bleed the problem of some of the violence that's become associated with it. Because frankly, the Syrian civilian population and the Iraqi civilian population are the real victims here, and they're caught in a larger struggle.
Well, you ask a good question about borders. There's been a lot of talk that we're seeing the end of Sykes-Picot, the map that was drawn during World War I for the post-war settlement. And all I can say to that is, yes, that one border has disappeared, the border between Iraq and Syria. The other borders are pretty much intact. And the only thing you can really be sure of is if you try to call a huge international conference to readjust borders according to whatever realities you perceive to exist now, would simply cause a whole nother wave of wars. Because someone would be aggrieved and someone would find it an insult, and it would be a disaster. So the notion that we just leave the borders there and take, shall we say, a somewhat Darwinian perspective, if people want to go to war, they're going to go to war over those borders, we can deal with that in a more effective way than we can in having a sort of concert of the Middle East where we try to solve all these problems. That's just not going to happen.
Is there another questioner above? Yes, please. Please tell us who you are. And,
like the Roman Forum.
Michael Gregorian, second year MIDP. First question, Ms. Townsend. You're with CNN. quite often. So the question I have is, several months ago, the same militants that we call today ISIS, they were executing Christian Armenians in Aleppo and other parts of Syria, and yet CNN didn't cover them at all. Could you please elaborate as to why? And Mr. Ambassador, drug overdose kills over 100 Americans every single day, and yet the supply of heroin from Afghanistan into the United States hasn't diminished. It keeps increasing. Could you please talk about that as a national security interest? Thank you.
So I'll go first while you work that out. Look, I have exactly zero influence over what CNN covers and doesn't. I will tell you, I was very proud of the coverage. Anderson Cooper stuck with the Syrian civil war story for a very long time. But you know, the news of the day moves, and it moved away from the Syria conflict. I had gone back to them on a number of occasions, including with the massacre of the Christians, and tried to encourage them. Look, you've never heard about the starvation of the opposition populations. There are pictures being circulated. I've given them to CNN. The scale of the starvation is on a scale of North Korea. It's incredible. The use of water as a weapon by ISIS to deprive populations of water. We're not talking about that either, right? You know about the Mosul Dam and the Haditha Dam, but we're not talking about the depriving people of water. So, I mean, there's lots of aspects to this conflict that the media has not covered. I wish I had an answer as to why.
Well, I'm not touching the media. On your question about narcotics from Afghanistan, you know, it is undoubtedly a huge tragedy and a personal tragedy and a family tragedy for many, many people. It is not a national security challenge. It is just a huge social problem. And at the end of the day, if we've learned anything from 40 or 50 years of combating narcotics, the demand side is where you start.
Gentleman in the red shirt, please tell us who you are.
My name is Jim Cunningham. I've taken a number of Ali classes with Joe Cattell, national security classes. I have a question, Ms. Townsend. You seem to be saying that the lesson we should have learned about Libya was have a phase 4 in place. Why wouldn't the lesson be don't topple a dictator? Because when you do, it's so unstable and you don't know what's going to come of it. So why wouldn't that have been the lesson from Iraq to Libya? Just leave Gaddafi in place.
Well, so we were presuming that there was this little issue of the Arab Spring, right, that it was not a condition of our making. And that really is where this instability generated itself from, right? Because you took these dictators, melted away, and there was nothing to come in behind them. In Libya, we made some choices about going in, about supporting the opposition. And my point really was where we make the decisions to engage like that, once you've made the calculation that you want to engage, then you have to engage sort of in a full-scale way, and that is understand that when you leave, not just you, but the coalition pulls back, that there's going to be an obligation then. Somebody once said it was the pottery barn rule. If you break it, you own it. And so if you're going to help break the existing system, then you better have a plan for helping what comes in behind it.
But I still don't understand why didn't we just make a decision? Don't break it. Leave Gaddafi in place. Just why wasn't that the better decision than to try to have a phase 4 in a seemingly impossible situation?
Well, you've directed this to me. I was out of government at the time, so I wasn't part of those conversations. But I encourage Dan to. Dan was in.
I'm happy to defer back to Fran on this. No, you know, just as a matter of historical context, the president consulted with his senior advisors and believed that there was a threat of genocidal acts against large numbers of Libyans by the Gaddafi regime, and that led to the creation of a coalition to repel and deter those Libyan forces, those Gaddafi forces. That was the genesis.
Okay, second level.
Thank you. My name is Andrew Cameron. I'm from North Carolina Central School of Law. I'm a 3L. And my question, Mr. Ambassador, earlier you stated that it was in America's interest to have a unified Iraq. And my question to you is, why would a three-state solution not be in America's interests?
Oh, well, so the primary reason why it's not in our interest is that a three-state solution is a guarantee of civil strife in Iraq. If Iraq falls apart along the lines most would expect it to fall apart, then the Shia get a lot of oil, primarily in the south. The Kurds get a lot of oil, primarily in the north around Kirkuk. And the Sunnis get a lot of sand. And the Sunnis who, you know, even as a 30 or 40% minority, ran Iraq for most of its modern history, all of its modern history really, since the British left, you know, have a sense of entitlement, and they're not going to, you know, inherit the sand, as it were. They're just not going to accept that. So, you know, frankly, I think it's an open question, if you took away the ISIS threat, whether we should much care at this point. But as long as you have a threat like ISIS in the region, and you have, you know, a danger of a continuing and growing jihadist threat, then I think it really is in our interest to have them hang together. I'll be quite honest, you know, I think it's an open question whether they will.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Austin Edwards. I'm a first-year Master's of Public Policy student here at Duke. I'm interested in going back to the President's messaging tonight, and not necessarily to those like us here tonight, but to the broader American public. I was 11 when 9/11 happened, and I've spent the majority of my life against the backdrop of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I see in the people of my age a very deep ambiguity and confusion about what America's role in the Middle East should be, and especially after the last 14 years. And so I'm asking you, what do you think, how would you communicate to a new generation where we should be and what we should be doing in the Middle East?
I took the last one.
Glad I'm the moderator. Yeah.
Look, I think this is why I think it's very important. Clarity is king tonight, right? I think the President's got to talk very clearly about America's role and interest and what America's goals are. I don't think that this is a long-term military commitment. I don't think it needs to be. And I think that the President needs to be able to describe the threat, the reason you need to do something, and what the something is, what his view of the something is. I think it will be important in talking to a younger generation that this is not America acting alone, that this is America leading and acting in concert with her allies, because we have an interest after 14 years of war to see stability in the region. But language will matter. This is this is an area where this is a gifted president, right? And so rhetorically, I think language really does matter here. And so, I mean, it's a matter of describing it, why it's important, what the objectives are, and how it's not us acting alone, I think goes a long way to answering your concern.
How does he get out of the conundrum whereas if he says he's going to be doing a lot, then our allies won't have any incentive to pick up the ball because they say, well, America's going to take care of this. But if he says he's going to be doing a little, then he'll be criticized as not having a sense of urgency.
I think it's no mistake. While you and I were here today, the President called King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. I suspect that the reason he made that call, and by the way, they did a press pool, so there were photographs of it. I mean, it was all part of the buildup up to tonight. I think that was not an accident, because I think the President ought to then now follow that up by saying what the allies are going to do, right? They've worked very hard to get commitments. I think they've got some of those commitments in place, and I think this is all part of describing America's going to lead, but America's not going to act alone, and here's a sampling of what some of our allies are going to do.
I think the President has actually shown that you can walk this line insofar as throughout the long and somewhat tortuous period when Maliki was holding on, President, made it pretty clear that Iraq was not going to get serious help from the United States so long as he was in power and his kinds of policies were going to continue. So I think his message is going to be, this is a threat to international peace and stability, and we as the guarantor of the international system and as the sole remaining superpower need to do this sort of thing. But we're depending on others to do their part too. And I think that's a message that will be popular with an American people who are weary of being out in front.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Evening. My name is Jason Singh. I'm an undergraduate here in the Sanford School of Public Policy. I want to take a different direction and ask, given that U.S. airstrikes killed the leader of Al-Shabaab over the past week, how does that change the threat from Al-Shabaab to U.S. interests in the region, and how should that change U.S. counterterrorist strategy towards the Horn of Africa as a result?
I'm happy to take a shot at that. So Mr. Godin was a nasty piece of work, and I don't miss him. I think that it's important, actually, Al-Shabaab, it's interesting to end this on a conversation about Somalia, because Somalia is, it's hard to believe anyone would ever attach this phrase to Somalia, but Somalia is a relative success story. It has crawled its way back, you chuckle, but it has crawled its way back from utter and abject state failure. There's a functioning government in Mogadishu. Al-Shabaab controlled most of South and Central Somalia and all but half a dozen blocks around the palace and around the airport until quite recently. The United States, quietly, working with European partners, embarked on a pretty comprehensive plan for Somalia that involved the Europeans taking charge of salaries for public workers in Somalia. The United States trained Ugandan, Burundian, eventually Djiboutian, and some Kenyan troops, and eventually the AMISOM mission, the African Union's mission in Somalia, defeated Al-Shabaab, and they really don't hold much territory now at all. They're really on the run. There's still a danger. They've gone from being an insurgent force that holds a lot of Somalia to being a terrorist group that is resorting to attacks outside of Somalia to show that they're still in the game. But it does show what you can do when you bring the neighborhood together, when you engage in the right kind of capacity building, when you incentivize the partners to come together and to do something. There were many people who thought Somalia was never going to be a country again, and it's really doing well. So there's still plenty of other nasty pieces of work where Godin came from, and the group will continue to exist. And the U.S. will continue to work with those partners as well as with the authorities in Somaliland and Puntland who are quite motivated in counterterrorism. And Somalia, step by step, is going to come back, and I think it's great news. It won't be completely linear, but I think it's a positive story. Iraq is obviously very different from Somalia, but I think it demonstrates the kind of success you can have when you have strategic patience, and that's what we really need.
And we have managed, to the extent it's a threat to us, right? So there's been much written about those from Minnesota and the Midwest who go over to fight. The FBI has put tremendous effort working with the Somali community here in the United States to sort of track and understand that and to stop them if they try to come back. The threat in and around East Africa, they have continued to be a threat to us in our facilities in Kenya and Tanzania as they have in the past. But again, it's working with local authorities, it's the capacity building that we've done, it's providing the tactical intelligence. We have managed that threat against our interests, even in the Horn of Africa, pretty successfully.
Well, this is the moment when we say that we have a small token of appreciation for our guests, and this really is a small token of appreciation. Fran, yours is smaller than Dan's, but it is the vaunted and rare American Grand Strategy T-shirt.
Fabulous.
And although it's small, we hope that when you wear it, you will be reminded of how you came to come and educate our community here at Duke on this very important night in our nation's history. So Let's give him our guest a good round of applause.
I love that.